Hello, and from the Watkins Museum. This program is part of the 27th Annual Civil War on the Border series. Today, I'm honored to speak with Dr. Lorien Foote. So, hello, Lorien.
Hello, it's great to be here.
Likewise. Lorien Foote is the Patricia and Bookman Peters Professor of History at Texas A&M University. Her latest book is Rites of Retaliation: Civilization, Soldiers, and Campaigns in the American Civil War. This fascinating work has been getting lots of attention. This year, it received the Organization of American Historians Civil War and Reconstruction Book Award. And this is becoming sort of a theme with our online programs. But last but not least, Lorien is also a fellow Jayhawk, so that's exciting for us.
Rock Jayhawk.
Indeed. So we asked Lorien to discuss the issues that she raises in this groundbreaking work. So, Lorien, shall we dive in?
We shall. I'm ready.
All right, great. So your previous books about the Civil War era explored how concepts of race, class, and acceptable behavior guided Americans both in and out of uniform. You continue down this path in Rites of Retaliation. So I'm wondering, what were the commonly accepted principles of civilized warfare when the war broke out in 1861?
That's a great question. So I think the first thing to be aware of is that Americans on both sides believe that it was very important that they fight a civilized conflict. And one of the most important elements of that is that a civilized war would restrain violence to the extent possible and protect civilians to the extent possible. So Americans viewed a savage war as war where people fought with unrestrained violence, unrestrained passion. But in a civilized war, the participants were disciplined and controlled, and they may have to kill people, but they would do it in a way that was controlled and measured and not more extreme than it needed to be. Another element of civilized war is that it followed customs of war that had been developed over the centuries by other civilized nations. So you were very well aware of what nations had and had not done in previous wars, and you followed kind of those customs, and you showed that you knew what those customs were. And finally, civilized war is honorable. And what they mean by honor, we kind of use today honor to mean virtuous or just. They meant honor in kind of its classical definition, which means you only have worth and recognition if other people give that to you. So honorable war is where other people who are watching you acknowledge, oh, look, they're fighting that war in a civilized way. And if they didn't acknowledge that, then you couldn't claim that you were.
That's very interesting. So quite a different approach to warfare than I think people are familiar with in the 21st century.
Yes. And it's interesting to see, I will throw in, since you commented on that, to see how kind of the concepts of civilization actually kind of continue to filter down till today. It's different, but the international laws of war are still kind of a product of those 19th century ideas about laws of war, civilized war.
So we are still living with some of these connections from the 19th century in warfare. Interesting. Now, one thing that I think a lot of our viewers will be really interested to hear about, because it's very much an understudied theater of the war, is the Department of the South. And your book uses the Department of the South as a case study in how issues of retaliation shaped the Union and Confederate war efforts. So can you tell us what was the Department of the South? And I mean, the Confederacy was the South to a certain degree, but, the department was a very specific geographical place. And why were the armies fighting over this region, and why did you choose to focus on it?
Okay, those are all good questions. So the United States and the Confederacy during the war, they divide the areas where they're fighting into military departments. And those department boundaries in some places change over the course of the war depending on the movement of armies. The Department of the South for the United States, its borders are going to stay relatively stable during the course of the war. But the United States defines the military department of the South as basically South Carolina, East Georgia, and Florida.
Mm.
And the Confederate counterpart to that was the Department of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. So that's the area where the book is set. And it began getting attention very early on. The Union Navy is going to make efforts early in 1861 because as the Navy is trying to establish the blockade, it needs coaling stations, places to stop and refit the ships. So the Sea Islands of South Carolina and Georgia are important for that. So the Navy and the Army are going to do some joint operations that capture those Sea Islands early in the war. And once that happens, the Union will occupy those islands for the rest of the war. And from there, launch raids against the South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida coasts for the next several years. And of course, taking Charleston has enormous symbolic importance to the United States because it was seen as the cradle of secession.
Interesting.
Okay, so then what was the next question? I forgot.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I probably piled on the questions too much. So you talked about what the department was and why the armies were fighting over it, this region. Why did you choose to focus on the Department of the South?
Great, yes. So the Department of the South was a great choice for me because that region became the focus of some retaliation incidents that reflect kind of some of the key points of contention between the United States and the Confederacy. So one of those is the Union's decision to recruit and enlist Black soldiers. That happens very early in the Department of the South. Like it does in Kansas. And so that's one area where we can see how retaliation plays out. Another one that's very contentious is over the Union Army's treatment of non-combatants. So when Sherman's army eventually enters into this department, Sherman's treatment of Southern citizens and their property becomes a big point of contention. And then the Confederacy's treatment of Union prisoners of war really plays out in this department because it's Union commanders in the Department of the South that first become aware of the existence of Andersonville prison, the conditions there, and then eventually when the Confederacy moves prisoners out of Georgia, they move them into South Carolina. And so this becomes a huge area of contention. So I felt that this department really kind of showed these key areas of contention, and they had retaliation incidents related to them that played out over several years, and they were unusually well documented. So there are some retaliation incidents we know that happened, and we have correspondence between the commanders, but we don't have like letters and diaries of the prisoners of war who were involved. In the Department of the South, we have a lot of documentation, so that made it a good choice as well.
Sure. Well, that makes sense. So, yeah, you mentioned the issue of African-American soldiers in the Department of the South.
Yes.
Could you elaborate on the role that these Black Union soldiers and also civilians, Black civilians, played in inspiring the two sides to retaliate against each other?
Yes. So I'm glad you even included in your question about Black civilians, because one of the interesting things that I talk about in the book is the line between those becomes kind of blurred in the Department of the South very early on, because what happens is when the Union captures these Sea Islands, a lot of the slaveholders flee into the interior of South Carolina. And so you have thousands of formerly enslaved people who are living on these Sea Islands that view this as a moment to seize their liberation. And so they actually form kind of organized military companies on their own to defend these islands against raids from Confederates coming across from the mainland. And so when David Hunter, who's an abolitionist general in the United States Army, when he decides that a strategy for the Department of the South would be to arm these Black men and use them to raid the mainland, he's able to draw on kind of organized companies of men who were already operating in a military capacity as civilians because they were defending themselves. And some of these men become the first sergeants in the first South Carolina regiment that Hunter eventually forms. And so the Confederacy is appalled by the formation of these regiments because the Confederates believe that under international law, an army cannot arm enslaved people or serfs. And so because that is encouraging servile insurrection, and that in a civilized war, you do not try to overturn the social institutions of the nation that you're fighting. So in their view, the Union Army's actions aren't legitimate. Blacks are not legitimate combatants. Instead, they're servile insurrectionists. So the Confederate government believes that this is an object for retaliation.
That's very interesting. Now, if you'll permit me to ask a more off-the-cuff question, you mentioned that first regiment, the 1st South Carolina, commanded by the famous Thomas Wentworth Higginson, the abolitionist. There was also, of course, the famous 54th Massachusetts.
Yes.
And I wonder if, that the movie Glory sort of portrays the 54th in an inaccurate way because it implies that it was formed of escaped enslaved men, when in reality they were Northern free blacks that joined that regiment, different from the 1st South Carolina. I'm wondering, you mentioned that the Confederates believe that these were not legitimate combatants because they were engaged in a servile insurrection. Did they feel the same way about the 54th and the other Northern black regiments, or did they have a mistaken idea about who they were?
Yeah, no, they did. And so that's actually one of the storylines that I follow in the book that really kind of shows a different view of how retaliation works related to black soldiers than kind of what we see before, because I was able to follow through all 4 years. So what happens is when the Confederacy first decides to retaliate, they pass the Confederate Congress passes a resolution that says any black man taken in uniform will be turned over to the states where they are taken. And they explicitly include the phrase, even if they were born free in a northern state. So there's 2 reasons for that. One, under many southern state laws, any black person is considered by default to be a slave. But second, it goes back to, because they view this as servile insurrection, they believe that anybody who is participating, fighting alongside regiments or alongside other men who are enslaved people, they're fomenting servile insurrection as well, and they're equally guilty. So they make this proclamation. So that's what's key about the arrival of the 54th Massachusetts in the Department of the South, because it is mostly northern-born men who were free. When men from the 54th are captured, first on an action on James Island, and then in the assault on Fort Wagner, which is depicted in Glory, the Confederate Army captures several men of the 54th Massachusetts. And the governor of South Carolina says, great, give them to me. I'm going to put them on trial, either execute them or sell them into slavery. Well, because the 54th Massachusetts is so politically connected and socially connected to prominent wealthy Republicans in northern states, these lobbyists intervene. And so the Lincoln administration issues a general order of retaliation that says, if you do anything to these soldiers, we're going to retaliate. What's been missed in that story before is that the Lincoln administration sets aside white South Carolina Confederate soldiers as hostages for the lives of the 54th Massachusetts prisoners. And the Confederacy knows that. They communicate to that. So what's fascinating is to follow the correspondence within the Confederate War Department, because as soon as they realize this, and they realize how much international attention this is getting, because the 54th Massachusetts is connected to prominent writers in the North who have friends in England, friends in France. And so the Confederacy, this goes back to the honor that I talked about. The Confederacy realizes that European opinion is against them on this issue. And so they actually back off. And my book follows how they do that. But the short part of the story is eventually the prisoners from the 54th Massachusetts are integrated into the military prison system with white Union prisoners. And the Confederacy even explicitly changes its law and changes the wording to acknowledge that freeborn black soldiers will be treated as legitimate combatants and treated as prisoners of war. That was a very long answer to your question, but
No, but yeah, that is fascinating. And so if we could focus in on some other examples of retaliation. So how did these concepts of retaliation play out on the ground? What were some examples that you uncovered of heightened brutality during the war?
right. So let's take the example about the treatment of non-combatants and their property. So in the last chapter of the book, I talk about Sherman's march to the sea and then his march through South Carolina. So Sherman has to be very careful to show that he's following the customs of war and to bring be sure that he's showing that he's civilized. So he issues field orders that talk about what kind of property can and can't be touched, how his soldiers are supposed to behave.
Mhm.
But it becomes very clear very quickly that, especially when his army gets into South Carolina, that the soldiers are not just foraging. So that foraging is allowed in the international laws of war. If an army is invading another country, it's allowed for them to forage to get food off the countryside, but they're not allowed to pillage. Pillage is where individual soldiers, without the restraint of their officers, enter people's houses, create damage, steal things. And it quickly becomes clear that Sherman soldiers are pillaging. Well, what starts happening is Confederate citizens and members of the Confederate military start murdering Union soldiers that are kind of away from their commands who are entering houses or pillaging. But what the Confederate citizens and soldiers also do sometimes is sometimes they also kill legitimate foragers. And then they make the mistake of putting signs on these dead bodies that say death to all foragers. Well, foraging is a war right. And so Sherman views this as an appropriate thing to use retaliation. So he communicates with his Confederate counterparts and says, it is my war right, according to the customs of war, to forage. And if you kill my men who are foraging, I will kill your prisoners of war in retaliation.
Wow.
But, Will, here's what's really interesting, and here's what I mean about how much it matters to them on both sides that they appear to be fighting a civilized war. Sherman also puts in the letter, if my men are caught pillaging or firing houses, you have my permission to kill them. And in fact, my own men are ordered to shoot down such men if they
Wow.
see them as well. So it puts in writing, here's what the rules are, here's how we're going to enforce that we're following it. But it also shows kind of an escalation of the brutality of war at the end, because what happens is the Confederate counterparts say, look, our people have the right to defend their homes. Your men are behaving in a brutal manner. We're going to keep doing what we're doing. And so Sherman, he ends up executing in retaliation 43 Confederate prisoners of war during his campaign.
Wow. Wow. Even with all the the lore about Sherman's march to the sea and the devastation in their wake, you don't normally hear about the partisans that were executed. That's
Yes.
amazing. Yeah.
And Sherman is a unique person. He's a unique personality, and part of how retaliation plays out in any given local incident, it depends on whether the commanders follow the rules of retaliation and whether they use the right ritual. So retaliation is something that is recognized in the international customs of war that nations can do to protect themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're trying to fight a civilized war, if you believe that it's possible to fight war in a civilized way, what do you do if your opponent violates the rules? Well, retaliation is the answer. It allows you to try to get the other side to reform their behavior. But it only works if both sides kind of understand what the ritual is supposed to be like, if they understand the etiquette, if they understand the language. And so in the case of Sherman, he understands it, but he also uses it kind of differently than other people. He's a very unique personality. And so that plays a role in how that retaliation incident doesn't end up changing the behavior of either side.
Right. Right. Hmm. Now, I think you touched on this a few times, but did soldiers and civilians feel they were becoming less civilized over the course of the war? And if so, did they worry about this or embrace it, or did they have different? Did they vary person to person according to their reactions?
Yeah. So what I would say is, even though there is quite a bit of variation, I would make the generalization that over the course of the war, civilians, military officials, ordinary soldiers, everyone became worried that that the war was not being conducted in a civilized way. And it was a real crisis of identity, because white Americans in particular, they believed that one of the things that marked them was that they were civilized, that they represented the kind of the pinnacle of human evolution, social evolution to that point. And when they looked at the things that were happening during the war, it made them say, wait, what if we're not as civilized as we thought we were? And it's really a crisis for them. So I think any historian who spends any time in Civil War primary sources, you see the word civilization, savagery, barbarian. These words occur constantly. And I just kind of broke down, why were they using them and what did they mean? Because they had deep meaning. So one of the things I do in the book is I use the example of Henry Hitchcock. So he's somebody who sits out the war until 1864, and then he decides he wants to join. And his uncle was a prominent major general and very important. So he gets appointed as the aide to Sherman right before Sherman's march. And Hitchcock's, his diary, I mean, he is obsessed with whether or not the army is civilized. And he's a lawyer, so he conducts a legal investigation. And every night around the campfire, he runs around to all the brigade commanders. Did your men burn any houses last night? Did you murder any prisoners of war? And he does all these interviews to try to find out, are we behaving in a civilized way? Are we restraining passion? And he becomes more and more concerned when he believes that they're really not. And I think his kind of personal journey kind of reflects what Americans went through over the 4 years of the war, from being very confident in their status to having a lot of insecurity about it by the end. So I call the Civil War not just a crisis of the nation, but a crisis of civilization.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, that image of Hitchcock running from campfire to campfire, interrogating these commanders, I mean, I can only imagine that some of them, welcome the opportunity to demonstrate that their men were behaving in the correct fashion, and others probably were so annoyed with him for asking all these accusatory questions. Yeah.
Well, and it's great because he, in the responses that he gets, we kind of see the range. So, I mean, he has some people who are like, who clearly kind of don't care. And, and they even say to him, we should do as bad as the rebels or worse. And then you have other guys who are like, no, we had no stragglers. And if we had any, we would do a drumhead court-martial right on the spot and march them through camp. So his diaries are kind of a window into the various ways that soldiers and commanders were responding to the challenges of trying to fight a civilized war when the violence is really escalating and spiraling.
I'm sorry to be so fixated by this, but is Hitchcock's account, has that been recently republished, or can you only find it in an older?
No, edition? Yeah, you can just find it on Amazon. So there was a recent edition. I can't remember off the top of my head when it came out, but anyone who's interested, the Diaries of Henry Hitchcock are available on Amazon, and you can order them.
Excellent. Okay, so most of our audience members are familiar to a certain degree with Bleeding Kansas and the Civil War along the Kansas-Missouri border, which you mentioned early on. So your book mainly focuses on, or to a great degree, focuses on the Department of the South as a case study. So how was the war different in the Department of the South than it was in other areas, and in particular, the Trans-Mississippi Theater in Kansas?
Yeah, so that's a great question, because there's one key thing that's missing from the Department of the South, and that is irregular warfare. So because, I mean, it starts to happen more later, particularly in kind of parts of Florida. But the problem is, in the Department of the South, the Union Army is not very successful. They never really are able to get onto that mainland until Sherman comes through in 1864. All of the generals who are tasked with taking Charleston fail. Union armies capture Jacksonville 3 or 4 times during the war, but they always have to leave. So their Union armies aren't really operating in the interior in that department for there to, arise kind of irregular warfare conducted by guerrillas or people detached from the Confederate Army. That's very different from the Trans-Mississippi, where from the beginning, guerrilla warfare is vital to how the war is being conducted. And in a way, it worked out okay that the Department of the South doesn't deal with that, because retaliation regarding guerrillas has its own dynamic, because both the Union and the Confederate leadership, they believe that guerrilla warfare is uncivilized. You are not a legitimate combatant in the official view on both sides during the Civil War unless you wear a uniform at all times and unless you are under the command of an army that represents the state. The problem with guerrillas, because they're not in uniform and because they're not answering to some kind of military hierarchy, both sides believe that that leads to uncontrolled, violent passion. You can't regulate guerrillas, and they're also using tactics that, in their view, are sneaky and less honorable.
Right.
So from the beginning of the war, the Union Army says men who are guerrillas and they don't wear uniforms, they're not legitimate combatants, and they even call them in their correspondence wild beasts, pirates, banditti. And so because they're not legitimate combatants in the Union Army's view, they can be summarily executed in the field like you would a pirate. They're not treated as prisoners of war. Well, what's interesting about it is that the Confederate government, Jefferson Davis and his top generals, I mean, these are West Point trained guys who believe in the customs of war as well. They're uncomfortable with their own guerrillas. They will protect partisans. So partisans might fight using irregular tactics, but they're in uniform and they are under the command of a colonel or a general in the Confederate Army. So Confederates want to protect their partisans, but they never effectively use retaliation to protect their guerrillas. And so actually it's interesting, we see that in Kansas and in Missouri and in Arkansas. Confederates try to use retaliation rituals, and Grant and Sherman and Admiral Foote, they always just say, you guys are wrong and you're wrong. Guerrillas are not legitimate combatants. We're going to execute them if we capture them, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Wow. Well, Lorien, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today about this amazing book, which is really getting a lot of attention. It's if you're interested, I encourage you to get it. It's a great read. It's Rites of Retaliation, Civilization, Soldiers, and Campaigns in the American Civil War. So, Lorien, again, thank you for speaking with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed the opportunity to share about my work.
Yeah, well, we enjoyed it too. And I want to thank everyone who is watching today. And also, I want to thank Lawrence Parks and Recreation for sponsoring Civil War on the Border 2022. So with that, thanks everybody, and bye for now.